Everyone. I am Jessica DeWitt. I am editor-in-chief here at the Network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am talking to Will Wright about his new book, Borders of Biodiversity.
Woo.
Uh, woo! Published with North Carolina Press, University of North Carolina Press, I should say, this year. Yeah, you want to introduce yourself, Will?
Yeah, Will Wright. I'm currently assistant professor of history and environmental studies at Augustana University, which is in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I finished a PhD at Montana State University back in 2021,
Mm.
and then was a postdoc at University of British Columbia with Dr. Heidi Twark. So
Yes, yes, and that's how our paths initially crossed a couple years ago. We published a piece on that research that you did with Heidi. But yeah, I was really excited when University of North Carolina Press reached out and was like, "Do you want to read this book and check it out?" And I was like, "Yes, yes, I do." So I thought we'd start off, start off by, just getting down to the basics of the book. So it's based on three case studies of charismatic species that have been the subject of substantial conservation campaigns. So I'm wondering if we could start by you talking about these three species and explaining your rationale for choosing them.
yeah, so the long subtitle of the book is How Gray Wolves, Monarch Butterflies, and
Mhm.
Giant Sequoias Transform Large Landscape Conservation. And I, I initially wanted to write about something that had to do with the biodiversity crisis.
Mhm.
I think when I was a grad student, I'd read Elizabeth Colbert's The Sixth Extinction, where she talks about a variety of case studies like Panamanian golden toads and other sort of species that are on the brink of collapse. Um, and so it really sort of hammered home, you know, species are disappearing at a rate, I think, 100 to 1,000 times the background rate in the fossil record. But it's hard to write about biological diversity like as a whole. Like it's very,
Yes.
other than if you framed it as kind of an intellectual concept or a scientific concept,
Yeah.
um, it's hard to kind of grasp. And so to make it kind of more tangible, I wanted to root it in specific species and specific sort
Mhm.
of case studies. And so the IUCN has like an extinction risk within sort of different taxa of species. Each one of them kind of represents a larger trend of biodiversity loss. So it's like 34% of all conifers are threatened with extinction, 26 of all percent of all mammals, and 40% of all insects. And so the sequoia sort of stands in for the conifer trees, the wolves stand in for the mammals, and then the monarch butterflies stand in for the insects.
Mhm.
So that was one rationale. Also, each one of them are just charismatic in
Mhm.
themselves. They tend to attract people. You know, wolves, everything from hatred to admiration.
Yeah.
The and so that there's kind of that. The monarch butterflies are, one of the larger insects or larger butterflies, so they're pretty easily to spot. And most butterflies use like camouflage or eye
Mhm.
spots to kind of blend in, and obviously they stick out since they're bright orange, so they're easy to spot. And then the sequoias are kind of a biological spectacle in themselves in California.
Mhm.
They're as high as a 30-story skyscraper, and they live, 2,000 years old. So many of them living today were saplings when Jesus of Nazareth was walking the earth, right? So
Really.
um, for those reasons, people are sort of attracted to these particular species. That was another sort of
Mhm.
rationale for doing them. And then each one of them primarily is situated on a particular border too. So the wolf case study is primarily rooted on the US-Canada border.
Mhm.
The monarch butterflies, although the migration itself is trinational across Canada, US, and Mexico,
Mhm.
is largely US Mexico. And then the sequoias deal with collaborations across borders when it comes to U.S. resource agencies and the
Hmm.
indigenous nations of California, largely the Miwok, Yokut, and Mono. So that also kind of, yeah, compared to borderlands, that each one was doing that. And so the central question I sort of wanted to grapple with is how and why do people of different nationalities collaborate when these species span political borders, both kind of international borders,
Hmm.
but also jurisdictional borders.
Yeah. Yeah. As you're talking, I'm thinking about how this charismatic species is so linked to. I've been doing more work with my colleague Sarah York Bertram on emotional ecologies and thinking about the way that emotions filter into our
Mm-hmm.
relationships with the environment. And I think that thinking about, the way that these species, particularly species, resonate on an emotional level for human beings is like part of the story. And
Totally.
then yeah, and then also just like the necessity of like those of us who have undergone very large topics understand the obstacles to figuring out how am I going to write about this really big concept and also be able to finish it within my lifetime. Um,
Yeah.
I did my dissertation on the history of provincial parks and state provincial parks in Canada and state parks in the United States, and
Yeah.
that over a total is thousands of parks. And I had to figure out, how to do that. And I still think it was too big of a project what I ended up with. But those of us who have done that really know how
You have to whittle it
critical.
down.
Yeah, you have to whittle it down. And that's something that maybe people who haven't undergone these kind of projects don't realize. Just like, yeah, so there's a bit of like your interests and like it's interesting, but also it's a practical thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and there's kind of a narrative issue too of like how do you tie those three stories together so that they don't
Mhm.
feel like these kind of three separate case studies, so like what's the
Yes.
through line?
Mhm.
Um, and for me, I guess my through line was that um, you know, climate change is accelerating the movement of species across borders. There's a scientific meta study that showed of about 4,000 species recently tracked. About three-quarters of them had shifted their ranges already. And they did the about uh, 20 kilometers every decade. Species are moving either up in elevation or closer to the poles. For many species, survival is going to mean moving across international lines. And so,
Hmm.
um, you know, we need more of these kind of collaboration and solidarities across borders if many of these, and so that's where large landscape conservation sort of matters and comes into the picture.
Yeah, yeah. So that kind of plays into my second question, which was, how is Canada specifically
Mhm.
interwoven into the conservation stories in this book?
Yeah, yeah. So with the wolf case study, it is both a comparative history of wolf eradication in
Hmm.
Western Canada and the Western United States, mostly looking at Alberta and Montana. And I tried to basically explain why wolves were eliminated totally south of the
Hmm.
49th parallel while they remained in certain pockets sort of north of it in Canada. And my sort of short answer is it became differences in how Washington, D.C. and Ottawa applied state power to those areas. Whereas there's kind of these very similar trajectories of both
Yes.
places. They both adopt bounty systems. It's both largely driven by livestock industries, but then they diverge in the sense that, the Alberta and other provinces continue with that system, whereas in the United States, they turn it over to the federal government and
Hmm.
say, we're going to have this Bureau of Biological Survey that's going to be the sole entity. And so that's the biggest difference that I think explains why they were eliminated totally. And then when this vacuum occurs, we in mid 20th century, we kind of have this change in policy. So you have things like the Endangered Species Act in the United States, but
Hmm.
also change in outlook, right? So the
Yes.
Canadian author Farley Mowat's Never Cry Wolf being probably the most
Hmm.
famous example of that. leads to more tolerance of wolves, and so they start to recover because of both policy and kind of cultural attitudes. And so they start reclaiming ancestral territory. So they start moving down the Canadian Rockies largely and start repopulating areas in northwestern Montana. And it's at this very same time that wildlife biologists are starting to use radio calling to track wolf movements. And they're you know these biologists, both at working in the Canada and the United States, are just amazed at these transborder dispersal movements. And so that becomes inspiration for the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, which is this binational collaboration between conservation activists, both in Canada and the United States, to think more about less about core areas and more about kind of connecting through wildlife corridors.
Hmm.
So that's the Canadian story. The second one with the monarch butterflies really is sort of rooted in Canada in the sense that people in all three countries had been seeing monarchs come and go for like the last 2 centuries.
Yes.
But there was this Canadian couple, Fred and Nora Urquhart, who were based in the University of Toronto. And they wanted to basically say, where the monarchs that we see every summer and fall, where do they go? And so they started this citizen science tagging brigade called the Insect Migration Association, where they asked for volunteers to tag monarchs and report recoveries. And that started right after World War II.
Hmm.
And by over the next 20 years, they grew thousands of participants, mostly from southern Canada and the US. And so then they finally, in 1975, confirmed that there's this trinational migration, this migratory cycle that happens. So it's kind of amazing, discovery of scientific
Yeah.
of the 20th century, and it's initiated by this Canadian couple.
Yeah.
Um, and then the sequoias probably is the least Canadian in the sense that
Yeah.
the sequoias grow primarily in California, but the sequoias themselves tell a story of kind of supranational climate because they were so instrumental in the science of dendrochronology. And so they do have a story that at least can speak to, anywhere tree ring science is used,
Yeah.
it sort of had its origins in sequoia trees.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And I think also, I mean, I'm sure there's like a story to, I mean, this is outside of the realm of your book and but a story of like, the Pacific Northwest like continuum of like so much logging stories into that
yeah,
growth
yeah,
forest there, and it's all connected, and tourism,
yeah,
I'm sure too.
yeah,
And yeah.
yeah. The Hume Bennett Lumber Company, which started in Michigan, um, and when the Michigan forests are basically cut over, the next two places that they go are
Yeah.
British Columbia and California. So, through kind of
Yeah.
the economic history of resource
Mhm.
extraction, they're sort of connected to. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. So I asked the question about Canada because this is niche,
yeah,
firstly.
yeah,
But also I think that it leads us to what I think is the primary strength of your book, which is the effective demonstration that these national borders are artificial and that they are detrimental to the ecological well-being of the planet. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how large landscape conservation troubles our understanding of national boundaries.
yeah. Well, to kind of preface it, right? Borders themselves are these power constructs, right, that nation states impose to maintain social difference largely. So who is a citizen, who is not,
Hmm.
questions of that nature. But when people realize that there's these species that span you know two nation states or move across the border and have these transboundary movements,
Hmm.
it then becomes a place of kind of social connection rather than social
Yes.
difference. And so, example, the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, or Y to Y. many of the activists in Alberta or BC or Idaho or Montana were like, we did conservation in Canada and in Canada alone. And similarly, people in the United States did it in there, but there was no interaction or no
Mm.
reason um, to collaborate or to connect. And so, a perfect example is Diane Boyd is a wildlife biologist who's primarily working right on the U.S.-Canada border near Glacier and Waterton National
Hmm.
Parks. And as wolves are sort of moving into the area, and in the late 80s, she collars a wolf named Kishanina, or excuse me, K. And K disperses, it's like 800 miles or 650 kilometers northward, and actually assimilates into another wolf pack in Pusku, British Columbia, before it's legally killed and harvested. And so, it's two-thirds of the way to the Yukon territory this wolf
Yes.
has moved. And so when people like Dan Boyd share that this is, then people are like, well, a place like Waterton or a place like Banff isn't really big enough to contain the ecology, and it's not just wolves, grizzlies, migratory birds.
Hmm.
And so large landscape conservation tries to move away from kind of the core zone thinking, right? Think of like these parks as kind of these self-contained units and trying to think about, okay, what are the corridors that connect it that mobile species need to use?
Yeah,
And so, yeah, that necessarily connects Canadians with, other people.
absolutely. Yeah, and it brings into question like why are we like for me, it further brings into question like why are we choosing this system of boundaries? Like how is it serving? How is it really serving us? I know how it serves like corporate, but like the people on the ground who are like, living and yeah, it's just it's a really interesting way to come into that topic and think about um what it means to live beyond the boundaries, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's, some, I think of like Michael Hogue has a great book called Métis and the Medicine Line.
Yeah.
That, the Métis were this nation that was bisected by the border, right? And so they tried to
Mhm.
maintain the kind of cultural connections when, you know, settler states try to impose this kind of binary space, right? And so there's these animals or these species kind of subvert the kind of binary space that states want to set up. And so then people on the ground say, well, um, there's a famous quote that I really like. It's of this rancher named Melu Anderson Ramirez. And she's like, I'm part of this corridor that connects me all the way up into Canada. So she's this rancher thinking about, the animals that pass through this kind of biological passageway,
Mhm.
um, connect me rooted in this place, in a place like, up in Alberta to Lethbridge or,
Mhm.
elsewhere.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think of also how the borders were, laid down in the center of Indigenous territories, spaces, and how their role in helping us move past this, I think, and thinking beyond these boundaries is really
Yeah.
critical and comes out a bit in your book as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I focus on in kind of the early 20th century, this couple named John George Brown. Kootenai
Mhm.
Brown is sort of his name. He's the first superintendent of Waterton National Park,
Yeah.
and his Métis wife, Olivia de Lyonnaise. Um, and in the 1870s, some of the last buffalo hunts
Hmm.
in the Milk River region. So the Milk River straddles in both Montana and Alberta. She was saying, basically, is when the Métis would come out and do these hunts, we would follow the bison, and the bison are, making these trans-border movements. So
Hmm.
we were, ignoring the border and sort of moving across back and forth, and then the wolves would follow along. They were after sort of bison for a food source,
Mm.
and so I mean, it just shows that there are moments in time when borders are more soft and open, and then there are moments when borders become more hardened.
Yeah.
Um, you know, particularly, in my own case, being in the United States, the U.S.-Mexico border being much more militarized,
Hmm.
and hardened, and um, and so again, I think one of the radical and important things about corridors is they hold the potential to kind of soften borders because people are kind of maintaining these connections when they realize that um, animals move across them through
Hmm.
corridors.
Hmm. Yeah, like while you're talking, I'm thinking of how this book could be really used well in a border studies class, paired with something like Benjamin Hoy's A Line of Blood and Dirt, which is about the US-Canada border. There's a
Yeah,
lot of scholarship on the US-Mexico border, and that could be really
yeah,
like just bringing in a different, yeah, the ecological side of things, I think would be really
yeah.
cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a probably a more robust scholarship on the U.S.-Mexico border, but there's seems to
Hmm.
be I would say a resurgence, or I don't know if it's a resurgence or a flourishing of U.S.-Canada borderlands work. So I think of like Sheila McManus's
Hmm.
book, The
Yes.
Line Which Separates. She's at University of Lethbridge, or Brendan Rinksink's book, Native but Foreign,
Mm.
about um, kind of native refugees who move across. So he talks about the Cree who get kind of displaced from Canada
Yes.
to the US. Um, so in some ways, I'm drawing on that scholarship, but also saying that there's this, it's not just the social ties. There's also a kind of biological element
Mhm.
of these kind of flows of animals too.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, in my mind, it became clear that there are borders at two different levels. So, there's these national borders, and then at a smaller scale, the book also interrogates the borders imposed on the landscape by fortress conservation projects like national parks,
Mm,
uh, wildlife refuges, etc. And I was wondering if you could talk about how fortress conservation projects actually buttress extractive capitalist systems and how wildlife conservation efforts and large-scale environmental forces like climate change illuminate the folly of trying to museumize nature in these ways.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think the large landscape conservation sort of really shifts the attention from kind of core zones areas, right? So
Hmm.
again, rather than seeing a park or a wilderness area or a wildlife refuge as kind of this self-contained unit, it
Hmm.
shifts our focus to kind of the corridors areas, which are
Yeah.
often places of intensive human use.
Yes.
Um, and so, um, you know, that's why do I invest so much time in things like flat fencing or range riding programs, right? They say these rural spaces that livestock producers use are also biological passageways for wolves and grizzlies, and so we need to think about
Hmm.
like coexistence methods, right? So range riding, driving animals together so that they don't get predated by wolves, or fladry being this electrified fence during calving season, right? Those are all things that allow livestock production to continue to exist, but allowed it to be shared in a more
Yes.
systematic way. Or thinking about particularly monarch numbers declined substantially in the 1990s, and that largely has to do with or coincides with the use of Roundup Ready herbicide tolerant corn and soybeans
Hmm.
for glyphosate. And so, you know, there's both attempts to think about like, can we use right of ways as places that we can create pollinator corridors so that the monarchs can move through kind of these industrial agricultural spaces,
Yeah.
or the University of Kansas takes over kind of Fred and Nora Urquhart's monarch tagging program. And eventually in 2004, they launched what's known as the Monarch Way Station program,
Hmm.
which is kind of it's basically asking the people who normally would be tagged to be gardeners, right? And
Yes.
so it's amazing that like I think they get like 3,000 new way stations every year. And they're, all over US and Canada. So for example, I interviewed Darlene Burgess, who had a way station near Point Pelee National Park near Leamington, Ontario. Um, and and so she's trying to do her part to sustain monarch migration. And then that becomes actually inspiration that she travels down to Mexico to see the overwintering site at the Biosphere Reserve.
Hmm.
And so there's things like that. And then obviously there's this tension between the way like resource agencies want to do prescribed burning, like Park Service or Forest
Yes.
Service, and then the ways that indigenous nations want to do cultural burning, and so there's kind of a
Hmm.
tension there. um, and so yeah, I really try to say that for because many of these conservation efforts are successful,
Hmm.
I would say it's because they shift the focus from kind of cores to kind of corridors.
Yes. Yes.
um, and that again kind of problematizes some of the ways that a lot of the conservation histories are based on one park,
Hmm.
and there's practical reasons for doing it, right? There's kind of it's neat and tidy,
Yes. Yeah.
um, but for many of the ecologies that are so-called protected by that, they're
Hmm.
much more, they flow in and out really,
Yeah.
and so I just tried to follow the flows rather than kind of draw a boundary around the park and stick to that.
Yeah. I think that that's so critical and something that I have criticized in a lot of park histories. Yeah, they stick to the boundaries of the park. And I also find that a lot of park histories are very origin focused. Like they're like, this is how the park came to be. And
Yeah.
then the end of the story.
Yeah.
But there's so much more going on within the park border, along the boundaries. And then if you think about it in these corridor ways, that's another level of thinking about this conservation. Yeah, that's great. And it had me thinking of like with the sequoias, it had me thinking of I grew up on the outskirts of we're on the border of Cook Forest State Park in Pennsylvania, which is the largest stand of old growth timber east of the Mississippi.
Hmm.
And it's called the Forest Cathedral, right? So everything's
Yeah.
around this Forest Cathedral. But now with climate change and the woolly, what is it? The hemlock woolly adelgid, is that how it's called?
Okay.
Like there's these forces uh that are risking the also trees die eventually,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Whether there's these outside forces or all. So like the interesting thing of like just focusing in on these specific, stands, whether they're sequoia or, and not thinking of them as like, oh, we're preserving like the entire landscape and thinking of it beyond those
Yeah.
charismatic, those things that are easy to um market, I guess,
Hmm.
in a lot of ways. Yeah, your book got me thinking about that again.
Yeah. And like, one of the things that they discover mostly through doing tree ring science, right, the sequoias is
Mhm.
that um, the last time that, again, they reconstruct these fire histories that are like 2,000, 3,000 years long, which is
Yeah.
amazing to be able to understand this kind of long-term ecological uh, relationships between the sequoias and fire because they leave these fire scars that they can date to specific years. And what they notice, uh, and this is mostly the work of Thomas Swetnam and his team at the University of Arizona, is during the medieval warm period, so before kind of the little ice age, so like around 1200
Mhm.
CE, they're like, well, the sequoias burned a ton, right? And so
Yeah.
they kind of use that as an analog to say, well, if we know if the future for us is a warmer one than we have present, then one way that we can build resiliency is by getting a lot more fire onto the landscape because it showed that during this last warm period we had a lot of fire, and then that got them saying, well, if it had a lot of fire, who's doing the burning, and then who's
Mhm.
doing then obviously led them to uh, the fire alone is not going to be caused by lightning. Lightning can only explain so much. And so
Mhm.
they start to realize that, indigenous people have been doing a whole lot of burning. And
Mhm.
that becomes the basis of collaboration that is still unfolding, right? Um,
Yeah.
Still an unfolding story, but
Mhm. Yeah, and another thing that your book and particularly the monarchs and the sequoias in this instance was got me thinking about, how the fortress conservation then um changes the local economy around tourism and how then that kind of is a new trap. A new like it's an extractive, it's in some ways a new extractive industry, right? Where we're
mhm.
bringing people in for an experience that they can take away, and the people who are living around it are then forced to, in order to stay in that location, are then forced to transition their livelihoods to making these tourism experiences
Yeah.
possible, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and I mean, particularly, I talk about this with the Monarch case study. So
mhm.
it's not till 1986 that a biosphere reserve is created. It basically happens in the aftermath of the discovery of this overwintering
Yeah.
grounds, and it just so happens that 30 different Ejido communities have land rights,
Hmm.
particularly to timber, and the Monarchs need, intact forests to
Yeah.
overwinter. And so there becomes then a big push, right, to kind of reorient their
Hmm.
economic activities away from timber extraction and towards ecotourism. But the monarchs are only there for 4 to 5 months out of the year.
Yes.
So what do we do in the remaining 8 months? Um,
Yeah.
and so there becomes a big, you know, one of the tensions at least is on the maybe positive, it's not a colonial, let's remove the people, right? So they
Yes.
stay on the land. Uh, but at the same time, the many of the rights that they had exercised have been circumscribed now. And
Hmm.
so how do we both kind of maintain the ecology that the monarchs need as overwintering habitat while still sort of meeting the needs of the community that relied on the forest?
Hmm.
Um, and so that becomes, sort of a key tension with when the biosphere reserve is finally created.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I really appreciated learning about that. Certainly for me, that was the case study that I knew the least about, like the
Mhm.
backstory. And um, of course, I'd known the like more like global anxiety around monarchs. I feel like, yeah, like as you point out, like a decade ago on the internet, it was very in your face, and but I didn't know a lot of what actually was going on on the
Yeah.
ground. So I really appreciated learning about that. Um, and rolling into the next question that I have for you is that while I was reading it, it really struck me that this is also a story of the development of the field of ecology and our understandings of ecology. And I was wondering if you wanted to touch upon a bit about how the history of science and as well as technology, which I think often go hand in hand, appear in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I've trained in history of science, history of biology. So that's one of my focal points.
Hmm.
And I would say one maybe sort of trend has been rather than kind of a social construction of scientific knowledge, thinking about kind of extended mind thesis and that um, our knowledge is actually rooted and through kind of material things. And so for each one of these case studies, there's actually a new scientific subfield that kind of gets developed out of them.
Hmm.
So it's not just the wolf tracking, but through these kind of radio and satellite transmitting devices. I mean, Etienne Bentonson's Wired Wilderness is a great book for this, but really the field of corridor ecology doesn't get developed unless, they can track these animals to show that they have these
Yeah.
kind of movements. And so the wolf case study definitely gets on that. The monarchs, a brand new field of chemical ecology gets
Mm.
born through that, which again looks at the kind of chemical mediated interactions between organisms. So the most famous one is probably I focus on a lepidopterist named Lincoln Brower. And he tried to prove that basically monarchs are poisonous. So, and the reason they're poisonous is, they lay their eggs on milkweed. It's the sole host plant. They consume the milkweed, and the milkweed has what these call these cardenolides, which are toxic.
Hmm.
And so they internalize those toxins and then put them out at the wings. And then that becomes a defense against birds, basically, because
Yeah.
and so there's a famous experiment that Brower did where he force fed monarch caterpillars cabbage so that there were these non-poisonous varieties. And it took them a long time. And then released them into cages with blue jays, and the blue jays would
Hmm.
get used to eating them. And then uh, after they get accustomed to eating them, then he releases one that's rated on milkweed. And there's a famous photo you can look it up online called Brower's barfing blue jay, where the blue jay eats it and then just basically yaks it right back up. Um, and so yeah, it shows that there's this chemical connection between milkweeds and monarchs through cardenolides. And so this field of chemical ecology gets born because of the study of monarchs. And then I sort of hinted at it. Um, so in the late 19th century, right, giant sequoia forest is being logged over
Hmm.
intensively. About a third of all giant sequoia tree forest is felled, in that kind of 50-year span, which prompts kind of the conservation saying we need to bound and protect these particular areas or they're not going to be here anymore.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a boon for scientists because they go and they can talk to the logger and be like, well, when was this tree felled? And they'll be like, well, 1891. And
Hmm.
then they can they realize that there's these kind of patterns of rings that they can effectively date. And then if they can date one tree because they know the outer ring, then they can cross date it with maybe rings that they don't know. And then
Hmm.
that allows them to kind of establish a master chronology. And so the tree ring science, it's developed by A.E. Douglas at the University of Arizona, who really, he's an astronomer. He's interested in sunspot cycles. And so that's why he gets interested in sequoias because there are these
Hmm.
long living trees. But then out of that then becomes various different applications, right? So uh, wide and narrow ring growth can then be a proxy for reconstructing past climates. Because if we
Hmm.
know, moisture is not very readily available here, then ring growth is more dependent on kind of climate variability. Or in the case then later, because fire scars leave their marks on particular rings, we can date them, and
Hmm.
so we can reconstruct fire histories. And so the true ring science or dendrochronology really is born out of this kind of irony of sequoia extraction. And so in each one of these, yeah, we have these kind of these new scientific fields that
Hmm.
develop. And so it shows that, you know, uh, our human creativity is bound in things, it's not some
Yes.
abstract thing. So I try to show that too. So we
Hmm.
see that sort of developmental progression.
Hmm. Yeah, I found that aspect really enjoyable.
Good.
And one that I didn't necessarily think of when I was going into the book, like, oh, I'm going to be learning about like the development of these different fields of science. I was like, oh, this is nice. Yeah, I just didn't expect it going in, but
Yeah.
um, yeah. So your firsthand experience of these landscapes, with the people on the ground and the in the conservation spaces is scattered throughout. the chapters. And I found this aspect of the text really engaging. And when I am reading, I find that, nature writers are often the ones who use first person perspectives, but it's much less common in environmental or
Yeah.
history of science spaces. So, um, firstly, I wanted you to wrap up our conversation today to kind of talk about how this on the ground research and exploration impacted your overall project, and then why you decided to include yourself in the narrative. And like, I feel like that likely speaks to your desired reach of the book and the audience that you're seeking. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so I I was really inspired by kind of field journalists, nature writers. So,
Hmm.
I mentioned one already, Elizabeth Colbert.
Yeah.
Her first book is called Field Notes from a Catastrophe. It's on sort of climate change. Or someone like David Quammen. He
Mm.
has a book called The Song of the Dodo. It's really famous, or his most famous one is probably Spillover. It's on the origins of pandemics that spill over from kind of animal hosts to human hosts. And so I really tried to kind of model that or try to mimic that kind of approach. And it's not so when I included myself in the narrative, it's not to draw attention to me necessarily.
Hmm.
It's more to draw attention to the people that I'm following. Um, so, these various episodes, it's trying to kind of show um, the work that is presently ongoing that I'm sort of learning from as I'm sort of following mostly scientists or other land managers kind of in the field. Um, so I did try to do that. I also wanted to show that there's kind of this unbroken history, that so like these historical trajectories we're still living with in the present. And
Hmm.
so by kind of narrating in the first person and showing these kind of moments in time is kind of showing, well, okay, I've talked about these historical trajectories, but they matter, now
Yes.
and aren't removed. And
Hmm.
so that way I could show kind of a more, it's kind of an environmental studies type of approach, trying to show the origins of contemporary problems or contemporary challenges.
Yeah.
So that was another reason for kind of doing that. Um, and yeah, and then again, it's a kind of a narrative technique. It kind of makes the narrative more fast paced, and
Yes.
so um, you know, again, I primarily, people in environmental history or history of science or borderland studies, obviously, scholars and practitioners in the field, but I also, wanted to reach uh, various conservation practitioners, but also people that are just interested in
Hmm.
these charismatic species. Um, so, there is people who are just monarch lovers and
Yes.
they, tag monarchs. They go to Point Neely and they tag monarchs every year.
Hmm.
Or again with sequoias and wolves. And so I also wanted to tap into that as well. And so for kind of those combined reasons, I decided it was appropriate to put myself in the narrative.
Hmm.
And there's starting to be, I mean, I realize that for some people, if they're doing like the 17th century, right, it's kind of maybe hard for them to put themselves in the narrative or for issues of, objectivity or whatever.
Hmm.
But I think there is kind of a break to say, well, these histories that we write are reflections of ourselves too.
Hmm.
I like Kate Brown is someone that I think is environmental historian who writes herself in the narrative. Um, and so, you know, I wanted to kind of experiment and kind of push to say, it's okay to include field work and things in the kind of narrative and not be so removed and detached
Yeah.
or disembodied from kind of the work.
Absolutely. I love that aspect of it. So I think you made the right decision.
Well, good,
Uh,
good. I feel good about it
yeah.
doing it. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
And it's making me think of if I ever have time to write my dissertation into a book, because time.
you
Um,
can do it.
well, nobody pays me to do it anymore,
I
Like I'm
know.
always editing other people's work and like there's no one.
Incentives are harder. Yeah.
Anyways, if that ever happens, you're making me think of, I did visit almost, no, I think almost all of my case studies that I write about. So it made me think, oh, like what aspects of my experiences in those spaces should I be putting into the text if I do the book. And I think that, like when I started my PhD 15 years ago, like my supervisor was super against anything like that. I
Yeah.
remember we read somebody's book for comps, and he was like, "What do you think about that?" Like, because their full introduction was personal, and I was like, "Oh, I like it." And he's like, "I peer reviewed it, and I hated it."
Yeah.
But shout out to Jeff Comfer, love you. But um, I do think that in the last decade or so, things are changing, and I think it's a good thing, particularly if we want what we're doing to matter beyond the academy
Yeah.
for people to
Yeah.
actually like pick up these books, feel like
Yeah.
they like that it's written for them,
Yeah.
etc.
Well,
Yeah.
and you make a good point. So, one of my training areas was in public history, and the
Yeah.
kind of classic public history is like, who gets to ask the questions,
Yeah.
right? And so if your research problem is derived from the historiography, that's a very academic way to approach it. But
Hmm.
if it's derived from kind of community members and practitioners, right, that's a
Hmm.
more public history approach. And so
Yeah.
that I would add that on as a reason why to include, I did, I think like 40 oral history interviews for the book. And it was partly, to get the kind of more recent story, like the 1970s forward that
Hmm.
didn't make it to the archives, but it was also to say like, well, what questions matter to you? Jody Hilty, you're president of Y to Y. What questions matter to you? And so that was kind of my public history kind of background, I think, coming through a little bit of trying to say, I want this to be a useful history,
Yeah.
a usable past. And in order to make it usable, I need to be talking with conservation practitioners and finding out what matters to them, and
Hmm.
do my best to bring that historical lens to help answer those questions. And so that was another reason for having that first person kind of interviews to show that, or be
Hmm.
be transparent about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, this was a fantastic conversation.
Yeah,
I
thank you.
It was a joy to read the book. It was a joy to chat with you for about 45 minutes about it.
Yeah,
And thank you for joining me today.
it was a pleasure. Thank you, Jessica.